Imagine a world where children's first lessons in intimacy, respect, and relationships come from a screen. An unregulated screen that is neither a parent nor a teacher, but a performer. Now, stop imagining. We're already there. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that I think for many of us sits at a really uncomfortable intersection. We're talking about technology, human development, and a massive, unregulated commercial engine. The conversation around pornography is still so often wrapped up in shame or, taboo. But the reality is that for minors, access is now completely ubiquitous. It's as simple as a swipe, a click. It's available 24/7 on the device that you and your kids carry in your pocket.
And that really is the central problem we have to confront today. It's the ubiquity. All the data shows that while this content stream is constant, it's pervasive. Parents, schools, even policymakers seem to be consistently caught off guard. They're surprised by the sheer scale of it, and especially by the very early age of exposure. And this creates a really dangerous knowledge vacuum.
It does. A huge vacuum. So let's unpack this. Our mission today is to do a clear-eyed deep dive into the source material you provided. We really need to understand how this highly accessible, commercialized medium is, well, how it's fundamentally reshaping the social, emotional, and even the neurobiological development of our youth. And we're going to be asking the hard question. Are we as a society responding effectively to this systemic shift? Or are we, through silence and completely inadequate regulation, just silently surrendering? Surrendering the education of an entire generation on relationships to a system that is optimized purely for profit over developmental health.
It's a profoundly complex issue. And to do it justice, we have to look past the simple moral arguments. We need to focus on the hard science, psychological, the neurological, and the sociological evidence. And we'll be examining the tensions in the research very, very carefully because the science, still playing catch up to the technology.
Okay, so to really understand the crisis we're in now, we have to start with context. We have to start with the digital revolution that just completely demolished the barriers that once, protected minors from this kind of exposure.
It's a good place to start. Think back to the pre-digital era. Not that long ago, really.
Yeah.
If a teenager wanted to get access to explicit material, it involved physical formats magazines, maybe a VHS tape, late-night cable, and each of those things required money, travel, a lot of secrecy, and a real risk of getting caught. That inherent barrier, plus the general social taboo, it restricted access in a pretty significant way.
And that barrier is, well, it's essentially gone now. It's vaporized. The sources are really clear about how the internet just obliterated those restrictions, made pornography far more accessible, affordable, and maybe most critically, anonymous.
Exactly, anonymous to the consumer. The medium itself shifted. Access went from something you had to actively seek out, a very intentional, risky act, to something that, as you mentioned before, now frequently finds the user.
It finds them through algorithms, through digital pathways they weren't even looking for.
Right. And the single biggest accelerant for this change, it's the smartphone. The data we reviewed really highlights the role of mobile devices as the primary gateway. When you look at studies of university students access through internet, tech phones, laptops, desktops, that accounts for over 98% of consumption. But the cell phone, that was the dominant method by a huge margin.
That's such a crucial distinction. We're not just talking about access in a general sense. We're talking about highly personalized, constant private access. In one study, cell phone access clocked in at a massive 69.4%. That just blows away laptops at 15%.
And that portability factor is key.
Yeah.
It's key to understanding the developmental risk here. It allows for viewing this content at any time, in any private context, all throughout the day. In a bedroom, in a bathroom, under a desk at school. This kind of privacy makes the traditional surveillance methods by parents or schools, they're practically useless.
Yeah, you might see a laptop left open on a shared desk, but a phone is intensely personal. It's password protected. It's always with them.
Exactly. It's an extension of themselves.
And the forces driving this pervasive content flow are just enormous. This isn't some niche activity. It's a global, extremely well-funded industry. I saw one estimate suggesting adult content is the single most searched category on the entire internet.
It is. And there are approximately 4 million websites offering pornographic content. That accounts for about 12% of all websites on the internet.
12%. Just let that sink in for a moment. The scope of that is staggering.
And this translates directly into economic power. The U.S. industry alone generates an estimated $3 billion annually. That kind of revenue fuels a constant, unending content stream. New adult content uploads increase by roughly 10% every year to the major sites. When you have that much money and that much content constantly flowing, it creates this incredibly powerful force, a force that systematically optimizes for engagement and profit, and it completely outstrips any societal or regulatory ability to react.
So, with this massive commercial engine in place, early exposure is no longer a rare thing. It's statistically normal. Let's get into the sobering statistics on youth prevalence.
Okay, so across several pretty reliable studies, the average age of first exposure ranges from 11 to 13 years old, sometimes cited as young as 11.
11, that's squarely in childhood.
It is. And by the time teenagers reach 17, three-quarters of them admit to having viewed explicit material. This is happening right in the middle of identity formation, of figuring out who you are.
And we also see those pretty significant gender differences in frequency and access, which I guess it reflects societal patterns in how boys and girls are socialized around sex.
It does. One very comprehensive study reported that over 90% of boys and 60% of girls had accessed pornography by age 18. And the frequency gap is just as striking. About 1 in 3 young men report watching pornography daily.
Daily.
Yeah.
Wow. So these statistics confirm that exposure is the norm, not the exception. But I think the real indictment of this whole unregulated digital environment comes when you ask how that first exposure happens.
Yes. This is where it gets really disturbing. The one statistic that should worry every single parent, educator, and lawmaker is this. Almost 60% of surveyed teenagers reported first stumbling upon pornography by accident.
By accident. That just reframes the whole issue, doesn't it? We're not just discussing active search behavior here. We're talking about a digital ecosystem that pushes this material toward vulnerable users.
Often unintentionally, but the effect is the same. It happens through pop-up ads, misdirected search engine links, or even just searching for adjacent terms on major video hosting sites.
And the emotional fallout from that accidental exposure is pretty high, isn't it?
It is. Unintentional exposure to sexually explicit material is reported to be disturbing and upsetting. 2/3 of college students reported feelings of surprise or shock when they first encountered it.
And this unintentional factor, it leads directly to what you call the parental information asymmetry.
Yes, that's the term. We know 3/4 of teenagers have viewed porn by the time they're 17. But at the same time, about 75% of parents believe their children have never been exposed.
That's a massive disparity.
Massive gap. And that cultural silence means the content itself steps in. It becomes a primary sex educator during a critical developmental period.
So when parents avoid the talk, about intimacy, relationships, consent, often just because it's uncomfortable for them, the vacuum is instantly filled by highly produced, highly accessible content that is, by its very nature, rooted in performance and profit, not in health or emotional connection.
And that content immediately starts influencing the emotional, the cognitive, and the behavioral aspects of sexuality in a developing mind.
Okay, so let's talk about the systemic failure that enables this reality. We've established the money driver, but what about the platforms themselves?
Well, big tech and the platforms, social media companies, video hosting sites, adult platforms, they operate with minimal, easily circumvented barriers. The barriers designed to restrict access by minors are, frankly, a joke. And the prevalence of unwanted exposure really underscores this systemic failure. Think about it. 34% of all internet users have experienced unwanted exposure through ads, pop-ups, or emails. The current online architecture, it prioritizes engagement and attraction above all else.
And the policymakers they're lagging so far behind. You'd assume that after decades of the internet, we'd have robust protective measures in place, but that's not what the data shows at all.
No. The failure of protective measures is widely noted in the research. Over 90% of the internet content filters that are currently available do not block access to adult websites entirely. They're easily bypassed by a savvy teen using a proxy server or a VPN. That's a profound failure of policy to match technological capability.
So the adult world's attempts to contain this are largely ineffective, which means the pace of technology and content distribution is just constantly ahead of the pace of policy, and it's the children who are caught in that gap.
Precisely. The cycle of engagement is prioritized. The ad industry funds the content stream that's aimed at attracting clicks, not fostering healthy development. The economic incentives are entirely misaligned with public health imperatives. We're talking about billions of dollars dedicated to maximizing attention and minimizing friction, which runs directly counter to protecting developing brains.
Okay, so now let's move past the external context, the technology and the money, and dive into the internal mechanism. How does this content actually affect the vulnerable adolescent brain?
This is where we need to really slow down and unpack the biological reality.
I agree.
Adolescence is a period of intense brain plasticity. After early childhood, it is the second most active time for brain development. This makes the brain highly impressionable. This is the time when powerful, long-lasting neural pathways are being laid down. The brain is essentially figuring out what stimulus is worth pursuing.
And the core vulnerability here rests on the developmental status of the prefrontal cortex, correct?
That is the absolute crux of the issue. The prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain responsible for executive functions like impulse control, risk assessment, planning, rational decision-making. It's the last area to fully mature. It often doesn't complete its development until the mid-20s. If we were to use an analogy, the adolescent brain is like driving a powerful sports car. The accelerator, the reward system, is fully functioning and highly sensitive.
But the brakes,
The brakes, the prefrontal cortex, are still being built. They're not fully installed yet.
that's a really powerful metaphor. So the biology is already inclined towards sensation-seeking and risk-taking, which is evolutionarily useful in some ways, but it's disastrous when you pair it with this kind of digital hyperstimulus.
Exactly. When a young person is exposed to pornography, it stimulates a massive release of dopamine. Dopamine is the brain's primary neurotransmitter for reward, motivation, and learning. This just floods the reward circuitry with unnaturally high levels of chemical gratification. And the brain interprets this intense, readily available stimulus as something that is supremely important for survival or pleasure.
So we're talking about an experience that effectively hijacks the brain's natural reward system, and it's doing it during its most formative period, creating this incredibly powerful loop. What happens when that system is just continuously bombarded with that unnaturally high chemical reward?
Well, it initiates what researchers call a tolerance cycle. This is a key mechanism we see in substance use disorders. Continuous high-intensity use leads to a physical process of habituation and desensitization. The brain tries to restore balance by downregulating its own response. This then requires the user to seek out increasingly higher doses, greater quantities, and more intense or novel content to achieve that same initial level of arousal or gratification.
It sounds almost like a neurobiological ceiling is being raised, like the bar for pleasure just keeps getting higher and higher.
That's a perfect way to put it. The pleasure threshold is artificially raised so high by the hyperstimulus of commercial curated content that real-life sexual and relational experiences, which are by definition complex, nuanced, and inherently lower in that immediate dopamine reward, they often fail to provide the necessary sense of pleasure. This leaves the user preferentially seeking the digital experience over actual human connection.
And this leads us directly to the concept of problematic use. I know the clinical classification of pornography addiction is still debated. It's not in the DSM-5. But the pattern of compulsive use, it raises these critical psychological and neurological concerns that seem to mirror recognized addictions.
And the neurobiological evidence here is genuinely shocking. We need to spend a moment on its magnitude. Studies using fMRI technology have demonstrated that high pornography consumption is associated with physical, measurable changes in brain structure. Specifically, researchers have found decreased gray matter volume and lower functional connectivity to the prefrontal cortex in high consumers.
Wait, hold on. Let's break that down. You're saying high-frequency consumption is linked to decreased brain volume. And these patterns mirror hard drug use. That's not just a behavioral issue, that's structural.
It is structural. And the magnitude of this finding really cannot be overstated. These neural changes are strikingly similar to those we see in individuals addicted to highly potent substances like cocaine, alcohol, and methamphetamines. The mechanism is powerful. That constant flooding of dopamine leads to the downregulation of dopamine D2 receptors, which makes the individual less responsive to natural rewards. And the decreased connectivity to the prefrontal cortex means the brain's brakes are physically weaker. They're less able to override the urge to seek that high reward. The visual stimulus is acting on the brain's deep reward centers in a way that is analogous to a powerful chemical substance.
That would explain the functional impairment we see. If the brain is physically rewiring itself in response to the stimulus, how does that translate into measurable compulsive behavior in young people?
Compulsive use is defined by specific behaviors. It's about loss of control, continuing despite negative consequences and neglecting responsibilities. For youth, this manifests as constantly thinking about watching porn, making repeated failed attempts to cut back, and neglecting key obligations like schoolwork, extracurricular activities, or even basic sleep. in order to view the content.
So the distress isn't just about feeling guilty for watching. It's about the real functional disruption of their daily life.
Exactly. The research is very clear on this. Problematic or compulsive use has concrete consequences. It's linked to diminished working memory, which directly impacts a student's ability to learn and retain information. It interferes with decision-making capacity, which can lead to other risky behaviors. And it has significant negative impacts on overall academic performance. We also see a correlation. Adolescents who view pornography frequently are statistically more likely to use illegal drugs, alcohol, and tobacco. It demonstrates a general pattern of increased sensation-seeking and addictive behaviors.
Okay, so let's move from the individual brain to the social self. Because what we see is a profound distortion in relationship development, precisely because this medium is acting as the primary source of sexual education.
Yes, it's acting as a curriculum developer. And it's doing this at a time when young people are trying to integrate their sexuality into their identity. But it's teaching them a very specific and often very toxic curriculum.
How so? What does that curriculum look like?
The medium itself fundamentally shapes a young viewer's sexual scripts. These are their internalized notions of how sexual interactions should happen, who should initiate, who should be dominant, what pleasure looks like. Mass-produced online content rarely, if ever, shows consensual, loving, or healthy relationships. Instead, the narrative focus is very often on dominance, aggression, power imbalances, and the transactional nature of sex.
And this means the emotional, the cognitive, the behavioral aspects of sexuality are all being established based on highly curated, often hyper-aggressive performance, rather than on genuine connection or respect.
Yes. Adolescents frequently report being in a state of cognitive dissonance when they then try to establish healthy, real-world sexual relationships. Their expectations, for instance, for immediate high-intensity arousal or a specific performance dynamic, they vary wildly from the complex, vulnerable reality of intimacy. And this gap creates a lot of frustration and disappointment.
And the data confirms this plays out in serious relational outcomes over the long term, right? Even into adulthood.
It does. Research consistently links solo pornography use to negative relationship outcomes. This includes a decrease in sexual satisfaction and intimacy with a real partner. The sources show that users often begin to define their real partner as a kind of sexual commodity, preferring the hyper-stimulus of edited content over genuine connection.
What about the impact on long-term commitments, like marriage?
The longitudinal data on this is really stark. One study found that initiating pornography use after marriage can nearly double the annual probability of divorce. It increases it from 6% to 11%. This really speaks volumes about how the secrecy, the time consumed, and the relational expectations fostered by the content just erode trust and emotional connection. And on top of that, frequent porn users, especially youth, are statistically more likely to engage in sex earlier, have more partners, hook up for one-night stands, and take risks that lead to STIs or pregnancy. So the influence extends far beyond private viewing. It translates into measurable, high-risk behavior in the public domain.
Okay. We've established a very compelling case for the direct harms of compulsive viewing, the neurobiological changes, and the relational distortions. However, a true deep dive demands intellectual honesty. We have to introduce the critical nuance that's provided by some large-scale epidemiological research. Research that challenges the simple narrative of porn causes distress. The data suggests that the association isn't always a simple straight line. We have to scrutinize the role of confounding variables.
This is a critical pivot in our discussion. It's so important. We have to avoid reducing this complex issue to a single variable. The relationship between viewing and mental health is profoundly messy. It's often deeply intertwined with pre-existing trauma and family stress.
So first, let's just firmly summarize the findings that do confirm a direct link, specifically in terms of distress and functional impairment.
Okay. Frequent pornography use is widely associated with adverse mental health outcomes like anxiety, stress, depression, isolation, and lower self-esteem.
And that link gets stronger when the behavior becomes compulsive, right?
It does. In university students, compulsive pornography use significantly predicted higher scores in depression, anxiety, and stress. And it's important to clarify that the primary predictor here wasn't just the act of viewing, it was the preoccupation with pornography, the inability to control the behavior, and the neglect of life obligations that came with it. That pattern signifies clinical distress.
And the emotional harm can begin well before compulsive use, often starting with that unintentional early exposure we talked about.
Exactly. The shock of unintended exposure, with 2/3 of students reporting surprise, causes immediate distress. And we also see gender differences in the harm reported. About half of boys and one-third of girls experience feelings of guilt or shame from viewing pornography before they were 18. This is significant because it shows that even non-compulsive exposure can generate substantial negative emotional consequences. It reinforces the cultural stigma while, paradoxically, driving the viewer toward isolation.
Okay, now for the critical nuance.
Right.
We need to look at the findings from those 3 repeated cross-sectional Swedish surveys. This study is exceptional because it involved over 13,000 high school seniors, and the researchers deliberately controlled for a massive, diverse set of background variables.
Yes, this cohort study is invaluable. It's invaluable precisely because it controlled for factors that many simpler correlation studies just failed to account for. When the researchers controlled for variables like prior trauma, family history, and general psychological disposition, they found inconsistent and often weak associations between general poor mental health and simply having watched pornography or how frequently they watched it.
That finding fundamentally changes the conversation. If general pornography use wasn't the consistent primary driver of poor mental health in this huge population of late adolescents, then what was driving the distress?
The sources are overwhelmingly clear on the stronger predictors, and they paint a picture of complexity where use may often be a symptom, not the root cause. What consistently and strongly associated with poor mental health, often far exceeding the impact of general consumption, were factors related to existing trauma or family dysfunction.
Let's detail those factors because this is really the intellectual heart of the deep dive.
Okay. Traumatic experiences were paramount. For girls, penetrative sexual abuse dramatically increased the odds for poor mental health across all 3 survey years. For both boys and girls, negative family circumstances were highly predictive. Parental unemployment, having overly controlling parents, having parents who were low in caring or emotional support and not living with both parents. Additionally, general rule-breaking behavior like truancy was consistently linked to poor mental health.
This suggests a really powerful interpretation, that many adolescents who report high-frequency use might be using the content not as a casual activity, but as a method of coping with deeper unresolved issues like family stress, neglect, or pre-existing trauma.
That is the leading hypothesis emerging from this sophisticated data. The researchers acknowledge that pornography consumption might be a predictor, or a mediator, or a moderator. But the association seems to be primarily explained by these underlying confounding variables, especially pre-existing trauma. If you have a turbulent home life, low parental support, or if you've experienced abuse, you are already highly vulnerable to psychological distress. High-intensity compulsive viewing may just be one manifestation of that distress.
And there was a very specific pattern that emerged among boys in one survey year, that unusual U-shaped curve.
Yes, in the 2014 survey for boys, they observed that both low-frequency viewers, those who watch never or only once or twice a year, and high-frequency viewers, those watching weekly or daily, showed an increased risk for poor mental health compared to the moderate watchers. This U-shaped relationship is similar to findings on general internet use intensity. It suggests that both extremes, total avoidance and heavy compulsion, may indicate a deviation from mainstream behavior, potentially signaling underlying personal or psychological issues.
Okay, so to synthesize this complex section, while compulsive use clearly causes functional impairment and distress, when we control for the devastating impact of trauma and family stress, the general consumption of pornography appears to have a limited impact on general poor mental health in late adolescence. But, and this is a massive but, that conclusion comes with a huge caveat. The type of content consumed matters immensely.
That is the next pivot we have to make. The focus shifts entirely from if they watch it to what they watch. When researchers isolated the consumption of specific problematic content, the statistical association with harm became robust and undeniable, irrespective of those background factors.
Let's make sure we use the academic definition here for the content that presents this distinct harm.
The sources define this as deviant pornography. That means content showing violence, children, and or animals. Having watched this specific type of content was significantly associated with poor mental health across the Swedish surveys. Even when controlling rigorously for pre-existing trauma and family dysfunction, watching deviant content increased the odds for poor mental health among boys in 2 out of 3 surveys and among girls in 1.
So this specific content is the bridge that confirms the link to behavioral harm and aggression.
Absolutely. Exposure to violent or aggressive pornography is strongly linked to aggressive behavior and sexual assault perpetration in both adolescents and adults. The sources emphasize that it increases the likelihood of verbal and physical aggression against a sexual partner. The hypothesis is that the human mirror neuron system, which activates when we see an action that might be advantageous to us, may cause males viewing this material to mentally visualize and rehearse acting out these aggressive sexual behaviors.
And crucially, this content reinforces destructive, distorted beliefs about consent and gender dynamics. It fundamentally shapes a young person's worldview.
Yes, it solidifies what's known as rape myth ideology. This isn't just a behavior, it's a harmful belief system. Men who consume aggressive pornography are statistically more likely to adopt this ideology, which is the belief that women secretly enjoy or cause their own rape or sexual assault, or that non-consensual acts are just rough sex. This destructive belief system is powerfully reinforced by the frequent portrayal of male-on-female aggression, degrading acts, and the portrayal of women as passive, submissive objects in commercial content. It internalizes a worldview where dominance is equated with masculinity and disrespect is normalized.
That goes so far beyond simple desensitization. That's the cognitive endorsement of violence and disrespect as acceptable parts of intimacy.
It is. And this intense impact, especially of deviant content, leads us to perhaps the most profound concept in the source material: the reconceptualization of pornography consumption in minors, not merely as learned behavior, but as a potential form of trauma itself.
That is a very weighty claim. It shifts the entire conversation. How can exposure to an image or a video be categorized as trauma? We usually reserve that for physically threatening or life-altering events.
Well, we have to focus on the individual factor in the definition of trauma. Trauma occurs when an external event exceeds the individual's capacity to cope or integrate the experience, leaving them feeling overwhelmed and helpless. For minors, the explicit images, especially those that include aggression, are so disturbing, so shocking, and so contradictory to their nascent understanding of human relationships that they exceed the child's processing capacity.
So the child is essentially witnessing the eroticization of violence and disrespect, but they don't have the fully developed emotional or cognitive tools to place that information into a safe, coherent context.
Precisely. It disrupts their fundamental frames of reference, their schemes for understanding the world, gender roles, relationships. The effect parallels the conflict a child experiences when they witness domestic violence. The psychological consequences we see in young, overwhelmed consumers often parallel the post-traumatic symptoms we see in child sexual abuse victims. It signifies a traumatic disintegration of their sexual system.
So what are the resulting behavioral patterns when a child's capacity is exceeded by this content? How does this trauma manifest?
When a minor can't integrate these incomprehensible contradictory forces like the eroticization of violence, their psychological system activates the three classic pathways of trauma response: flight, fight, and freeze.
Okay, let's dedicate some time to mapping those out. Let's start with flight.
The first is flight. This manifests as psychological distancing or isolation, both from oneself and from others. The youth often retreats emotionally. And this isolation, paradoxically, can reinforce further compulsive pornography consumption because the digital content is the only private, readily available source of that intense high-reward stimulus. It becomes a coping mechanism that actually deepens the initial trauma by fostering further retreat.
The youth is seeking comfort or escape in the very thing that traumatized them. Wow, what about the aggressive response fight?
The second is struggle or fight. This is the attempt to overcome the trauma's impact through aggression or sexual coercion. Sexual coercion or dominance in real-world interactions might be an attempt to modulate those contradictory, overwhelming emotions or to avoid the humiliation of feeling unable to integrate the content. They're trying to regain control over the overwhelming content by acting out the dominant or aggressive sexual scripts they've observed.
And the third, freeze, which is often seen as dissociation.
Exactly. The third is dissociation or freeze. The minor is so unable to integrate the incomprehensible scenes and messages that they develop a posture of psychological or emotional surrender. It's a form of re-victimization. They might mentally check out or learn to view themselves or others only through the lens of objectification, which is a common psychological defense against overwhelming trauma.
That idea that viewing itself can be a form of trauma, it shifts the entire paradigm of how we counsel young people. It transforms what might have been seen as a judgmental conversation about bad behavior into a trauma-informed intervention focused on healing and integration.
Exactly. And this reconceptualization has immense implications, especially for treatment. If the symptoms stem from a traumatic disintegration of the sexual system rather than just from conditioned learned behaviors, it means traditional approaches focusing only on behavior modification will be insufficient. It emphasizes the call from pediatric organizations for professionals to look at the child's entire life situation, especially any underlying traumatic experiences like abuse or neglect.
This brings us to the most practical, pressing question of all. How should we respond? How do we respond to a problem that is ubiquitous, deeply rooted in both psychology and technology, and often hidden by a wall of cultural silence?
Well, the primary failure is that educational and communicative vacuum we've discussed. The danger of that knowledge vacuum just cannot be overstated. The data confirms that many young adults report that pornography is their primary source of sex education.
That means the default instruction on intimacy, on consent, on relationships, even on physical safety, comes from a context rooted in performance, profit maximization, and often aggression.
And this leads directly to that cognitive dissonance in real-world relationships. Both male and female users often find themselves in these cognitively dissonant positions when they're trying to establish healthy sexual intimacy, because their expectations formed by highly curated digital content vary so greatly from the complexity, the vulnerability, and the mutual care required in reality.
We have to acknowledge something else here too, though. We reviewed data that showed nearly half of youth, 45% of teens, actually report learning helpful things about sex from pornography. Now, that's an alarming statistic given the content's themes of dominance and objectification, but it's a necessary data point. What does that tell us about the quality or even the existence of the alternatives we're currently providing?
It tells us the current alternatives, if they exist at all, are failing spectacularly. The fact that a medium designed for adult profit is providing utility, even perceived utility, to young people, it just highlights their desperation for information. The educational imperative from pediatric organizations is clear. Professionals in schools, social services, child psychiatry, they have to address the child's entire life situation, especially pre-existing traumatic experiences like abuse or neglect.
So the intervention needs to be trauma-informed and holistic. It has to recognize that if a young person is consuming pornography compulsively, it's often intertwined with deeper issues. Issues like family stress, low self-esteem, depression, or prior trauma. We have to treat the human being in their context, not just the behavior on the screen.
Yes. The adult world has to reclaim the role of educator and container for healthy sexual development. Silence and simple abstinence-only approaches are demonstrably ineffective when the digital platform operates 24/7 with massive financial backing.
So can we flip the script? Can we use the same technology that delivered the problem to deliver the solution? Can we meet these young people where they already are?
The sources suggest there's a real, untapped opportunity in digital health initiatives. The strengths of digital intervention are significant. Since media consumption is flexible and constant, interventions can be too. Digital health offers scalability, privacy, and real-time accessibility, which is especially valuable for isolated populations or those avoiding traditional counseling due to stigma.
What are some concrete, scalable examples of digital interventions that are leveraging this new media landscape effectively?
Well, text messaging programs are highly effective because they utilize the high cell phone use among teens. Programs like SexInfo and Hookup provide sexual health information and clinic referrals via text. These tools offer assistance and information in real time as issues arise, which is far more relevant than a lecture given 6 months prior in a classroom.
That privacy factor is huge. It moves the intervention away from a mandated public classroom setting to a private, accessible, and anonymous tool on the device they already use constantly.
Exactly. We also see strong evidence for computer-based learning tools that focus on interactivity. Programs like Project Light Tea, which was aimed at increasing adolescent condom use, showed efficacy, with participants reporting fewer sexual partners compared to controls. Interactive video programs, where participants actively choose the storyline based on their decisions, have proven effective in changing attitudes and behaviors, like increasing self-efficacy and creating more positive attitudes toward waiting for sex.
So these interventions respect that developmental need for privacy and self-determination while delivering complex information.
They do. However, there remains a significant theoretical challenge for researchers and intervention designers. Existing social and psychological theories don't easily account for users' new, complex roles in the digital sphere. Young people today aren't just passive consumers, they're also active creators and distributors of content. Think about sexting or social posts that blur lines with adult content. This suggests that new theoretical models of study and intervention are necessary to understand and address the full dynamic spectrum of digital sexual behavior. We have to move past the simple consumer model.
Okay, so let's bring this all together.
If we connect all the threads of this deep dive, the key finding is really one of complexity. The overall impact of pornography on youth is highly nuanced. For general non-compulsive use, the association with poor mental health is often inconsistent. It's heavily mediated by pre-existing trauma, socioeconomic stress, and family instability. And that means we have to address the underlying distress first.
But that nuance just disappears when the content turns aggressive.
Yes. Critically, the exposure to deviant content, that which contains aggression or violence, presents a distinct, measurable, and profound harm that often aligns with the true traumatic experience. This demands a clear, trauma-informed approach from the adult world. Schools, social services, and child psychiatry must shift focus to the child's entire life situation, not just on the visible symptom of compulsive consumption. We have to see consumption not just as a choice, but as a potential sign of developmental vulnerability and unaddressed trauma.
And that brings us right back to our starting point and the uncomfortable truth about that knowledge vacuum. We established that 45% of teens report learning helpful things about sex from pornography, despite its pervasive themes of dominance, aggression, and objectification. The profit-driven digital platform is operating 24/7 as the default sex educator. So we leave you with this final provocative thought. If nearly half of our youth are deriving their most useful information about intimacy and relationships from an unregulated commercial medium, what does that tell you about the quality or even the existence of the healthy, comprehensive, consent-based alternatives we are currently providing? How do we, as a society, reclaim the role of educator and container for healthy sexual development when the digital platform operates on every device, every hour of every day? That is the systemic challenge that will define the next generation.